So my name is Damon Thomas, and I write about the weirdness of growing up in a very rural Dixie County, Florida. One thing I didn't put in my bio is I was actually born during the only week that Disco Duck was #1 on the Billboard Top 100 charts here in the US. Things went about how you would expect from there. So there's a chat over here as well. I'm going to type some stuff in it. So I've said hello and put in my website, which has some more stuff about me, including a whole lot of spoken word albums. If anybody's interested, free to stream and download. Um, and so what we're going to do today is if anyone would like to do an intro in the chat, feel free. We don't have time for intros here today, just time crunch, time crunch. But basically, if you want to introduce yourself, that's fine because I'm a very nosy person. Also, as we're talking, any sort of questions that you may have, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be taking a few breaks to do a little work every so often. And during those, I'll kind of look through the questions. And if anything hasn't been covered, come back to it. So I like to start by paraphrasing Kurt Vonnegut. He had his lessons for writers, his tips for writers, and he basically said, to heck with suspense. The reader should be able to understand the end of the story if some type of bug had ate the last few pages. And so that's what I'm going to do here. Essentially what I'm going to say is that we actually already live in poetry. This is Poetry Month, but we have poetry life. We live in poetry, but we express these stories, these incidences, we express them in prose. And what we're trying to do is deconstruct this personal narrative to get back to the original poetry. This is kind of a thing that I've been working with, and in my case, it actually started via an oral tradition type approach. I had this great grandpa, my dad now, and they live in this small town on the other side of Florida, the Gulf Coast and the Big Bend. They call it the Nature Coast. It's not as fancy as it sounds. And so they live over there, and they've spent all this time where they just kind of hang out in front of whatever country store. They'll have a name like Higginbotham's or something like that. That's what all those stores are named. And they'll just basically swap stories with whoever comes by. But the problem is people are coming and going very quickly. And so first my thinking was, if I were sitting in those same places, what would my stories be? From there, it became, a realization that these stories, you only have so much time. People are coming and going. They're buying what they need. They're hitting the road. Those sweet potatoes have to put themselves in the ground. They don't get there themselves. And so, you really kind of have to move quickly. And so I started thinking these sorts of things. Now, at times, this kind of reconsideration of context, gets to be kind of a thing that people worry that if I don't give all this background, will people know what I'm talking about? How will that go? And anyone that's looked up a recipe recently realizes that you've got to have an entire life story to make enchiladas. Not true, not true. An interesting thing that I like, via the sort of writer mystic Alan Watts, was a story of a cat. He talks about looking through a gap in a fence, and you see the head of the cat as the cat walks by, and it goes through the body into the tail. And so through the idea that from kind of a purely causal standpoint, that the head caused the body, caused the tail, rather than it's all one thing. It's one cat. Our story is one thing, our story. All that really changes is the narrative lens. And a good example that I like to bring up in these cases, talking about when I was a kid, I would go to the flea market, specifically the one in Chiefland, Florida, all the time. And I would buy random comic books and things like that. And one that I liked to find was Rom the Space Knight. And so here's a comic put up by Marvel. It's based on a toy that I didn't own. I would see random episodes, random issues of this comic. Hello. Random issues of this comic, and they were completely out of order, but it was great. Never mattered. I didn't see anything. I didn't know anything. It just looked awesome. It was really cool. He's constantly shooting lasers at these aliens. I think they were called like dire wraiths or something nonsense, but it didn't really matter. It's basically the story itself was interesting as I saw it. For a local example, I guess, It's like I make a lot of stickers. My books, my writings, my spoken word albums actually probably have about as many stickers or more than many local bands. And this is a thing to where, sticker. This is a thing to where, you pass stickers to people, and here's this interesting object, and people are like, thanks. And in most cases, they're done. That's it. That's all you need. Very rarely people will ask, well, what is this rural gloom you speak of? Also, being from an actual rural area, I'm unable to say the word rural. It's always going to sound like a dog-based Pokemon type situation. So really, that's the thing we're working with, that if we kind of craft these interesting objects, these little stories, these small narrative poems, that's something that we could easily share, and it will, read well and convey our meaning. And the most important part is people will listen. Now, I mentioned this is Poetry Month, this is Poetry Fest, and it's poetry. This is something, though, that I feel could be, sort of a toolbox that could be used for lots of different types of writing. I believe, great advice by Baudelaire. It's to always be a poet, even in prose. And that's what I'm working with and what all should work with. So this is about poetry, but it's about your story as poetry, your personal narrative. And so a lot of times I get people say, well, nothing really interesting happens to me. I've got no stories, and really that's not true. Everyone has interesting bits, there's lots of things to say. Or, they come and they say, well, I, I don't want to be talking about myself. That's not a thing. I just don't want people will think, why am I talking about myself so often? And I like to bring up, very early on in Walden, Thoreau basically said that he wouldn't write about himself so much if he knew as much about anyone else. And so, that's basically we are us experts. I'm working from very basic notes. I'm going to talk a whole lot. I don't even know what my word count will be. It will be very high. And that's because I'm talking about me. I know about me. I'm a me expert. Um, Now, getting back to the idea that interesting and stories and what we have to tell, I like to bring up something that comes from, one of the many Carlos Castaneda books. Here, if you're not familiar, he's interacting in kind of a southwestern desert with a shaman named Don Juan. It may or may not have happened, but for our purposes, it's a good example. Now, here you get a thing to where they're out in this desert, and he's like, well, I really wish, there's just nothing happening here. It's really boring. There's just nothing going on, and he is told, by his mentor to just, if you look around, if you look closely, even in a desert, a fairly barren landscape, as we would say it, there's, just all of this life. There's all of this flora, this fauna. There's all of these struggles to live. It's like extremely limited resources. It's like all of these plants that have adapted to find the water, to find the food. And so it's like that with every life. We're not quite in a desert, most of us. So some of us might be in a desert here, but if we really look, there are interesting things to see. It's kind of like over the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, it was inscribed, "Know thyself." Now, an interesting case, and probably an extreme case, but once again, proof that everyone has something interesting to say, is Harvey Pekar, who wrote, a lot of indie comics starting in the mid 70s as American Splendor. And so he called it a neo-realism, and he was an extreme case to where it might just be one page of him hanging out with a coworker. He worked as a file clerk at the VA to pay the bills while he wrote his comics. But he would just be like, well, here's this guy, Harvey. Look at his clothes. Where'd you get those clothes? Oh, I got them at a secondhand store. This guy knows how to save money. And so that was a story, but he found it interesting. And so it was good. Now, here too, a thing that I would like to kind of work with is, some people are like, well, who would listen to these stories? What's the market? And so I like the quote, and anybody that watches Mystery Science Theater 3000 will have heard the quote. But I like the quote, the founder of that show. It's like Joel Hodgson. It's like, we didn't ask who would be the market for the show. We didn't ask who would get this show. The right people will get it. And that's kind of what we're working with here. Once you get the story in a form that you enjoy, the right people will get it. Very similar to Timothy Leary and his, find the others. And hey, here we are. We're the others. there's lots of people that want stories. There's lots of people that hear your stories. And, I think getting your stories down into this kind of pithy form, getting your stories back to the original poetry will help you share them better. So, what I'm going to do in a few minutes, I'm going to take a break and give you 5 minutes to kind of select your stories. You need at least one that you're going to be working with later, but you can, have more. It's like more stories, the better. But you're going to be working with one. Um, the only thing is, you know, as an idea, there was a time in the 90s where I actually called up. There'd be this show, it's called Rockline, and you could call, and there would be various musicians, and you could try to call and get to ask them a question on the air. And so Ozzy Osbourne was on the air, and I dialed over and over and over, and it would just ring until it said your call could not be completed. It's dialed. Now, I had a lot of good questions for Ozzy. I was really excited about the possibility of a Black Sabbath reunion. And since then, actually, they've reunited twice. So don't worry. My question was answered by time. Life evens the score. But, I just never got through. So the very next week, I was calling, and it was Midnight Oil, an Australian rock band, songs about beds are burning, that sort of thing. And so here we are, I call up, and very early within the first app, first few dials, I got through. And someone with an Australian accent, I guess was screening, and it's like, well, what's your question? And I didn't have a question. I had nothing. I had nothing to say. And so from there, I mumbled something about, what are your influences? And they're just like, thanks for calling, click. That was that. So basically, enthusiasm matters. The only rule here is it has to be a story that you find interesting. You can't go, I mentioned, say, the case of the Harvey Picar, and that is what he did. He enjoyed these stories. This was something he thought was funny. It's something he enjoyed, something he liked. And so you just need to do the same thing. So what I'm going to do is set a timer for 5 minutes, and then I'll come back and we'll start working with these stories starting now. And we're back. You should have at least one story to work with here for those that just joined. I gave a kind of a quick introduction and the idea that we're going to be working with our stories and then trying to strip them down to get back to the original poetry. We live in poetry and usually express our stories in prose. We're kind of getting back to the original starting place here. And so, what I want to do now is the second phase. This we're getting into a few specifics, and I'm going to quickly cover about 3 of a dozen or so items that I consider as I write. These are things that I've used to release a great many spoken word albums, books, even a comic book recently. And so this is something that's worked for me. And so hopefully you can find something that works for you. Consider it sort of a toolbox approach. It doesn't have to be the only way you write, but it's things that you consider as you do write. And, normally, it's good to be able to talk to you all here. This is usually the only sort of stuff that you would hear here in Jacksonville, Florida, as you're sitting on the Skyway. I hop on there and start talking about this stuff. Now, my dad still lives where I grew up over on the west side of Florida, and it's a case to where you hear all this stuff about rural Florida and small town, and you hear all these things, and it really becomes a case to where you hear simple life and slow times and sweet tea and ceiling fans. But the reality is it's fairly isolated. He's over there, a bit ago, he broke his ankle and, walks out his front door and, he has to use his crutches to kill a rattlesnake that's in front of his porch. And so, this is the sort of thing that people generally don't talk about, as they're talking about these small towns. This isn't what's getting people to retire to small town Florida or small town America in general. And it's interesting to me that I first started kind of writing these things as I would read, say, really harsh Southern Gothic works like Harry Crew's A Feast of Snakes, and I would recognize the settings and I would recognize the people, but I wouldn't see myself in there. And so I say that I'm kind of writing myself around the edges, kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead style. And it's a case to where I'm adding my stories to these mixes. But once again, people feel often, this is kind of an interesting thing I find, that Southern Gothic is over, that it's a 1930s through a 1970s period piece, which I will definitely tell you that there are places in Florida that if you walk barefoot after a rainstorm, you'll still catch hookworm. It's like things are exactly the same in many ways, unfortunately, as they were during that 40-year period piece range. So what I'm going to suggest as point 1 is to do the opposite of what was recommended in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. If you've not seen it, it's a movie, Jimmy Stewart there, John Wayne. And so you have an idea, spoiler alert, that you've got this big story to where this specific event happened in a specific way. And as the truth comes out years later at the passing of one of the main characters, as the truth comes out, you end up in a situation to where, the news people just fold up their pads and just head out. And the idea being that when the myth becomes the truth, you print the myth. You've got this legend, you've got this thing, and it's like, oh no, we can't refute that. And so often what you find is that there is this sort of this idea, this concept projected. And, I'm writing from Florida, I'm in Florida, this could apply anywhere. It's all really a matter of considering what, is kind of projected on your area. But you get this idea that, Florida should be a certain way. It's here, it's all Florida man and it's quirky and it's sort of zany and it's kind of, once again, it kind of, it's kind of reductionist. It's not the whole story, but people often feel that they can only communicate the story as it's commonly told. And so challenge number 1 is to kind of reconsider the tropes of your region. It's like, oh, I have to tell a story where there's lots of zany people. It's like, not necessarily. An interesting case here, and where I personally kind of like, kind of a precursor of the Florida Man legend. In the 80s, Errol Morris, he created a movie called Vernon, Florida. Now, Vernon, Florida is a small town up in the Panhandle. Now, at one point, a big hunk of the lost limb insurance claims were coming from this teeny tiny little town. And so it's like he goes and he starts to try to make a movie about that. Like, what's going on here? It was so extreme that in the area, people were starting to call it Nub City, which, it's like once you've hit that level, once you've got that nickname, something's going on. So once he's up there, he starts to get threats. One of his camera crews ran off the road, and then he realized it's not safe to make this movie. So he uses the B-roll footage to make all of this quaint and quirky. You've got the guy from Chicago that comes down and talks about how happy he is to be bored. You've got this guy that's really intense about hunting turkeys, a lot of other things, a lot of old timers, talking their old time ways. So the thing to consider here is that, yes, that did exist. That was something he saw, but he only talked about that after death threats over a lost limb insurance racket. Now, another point I'd like to consider, and it kind of gets back to a story, late 90s, there was a club in Gainesville, Florida, and it was sort of a loud music, punky venue club, cheap bands, cheap beer, that sort of thing. It was right across from the Hippodrome at the time. Strange place for this sort of thing, but, right next to the Hippodrome. So what happened is eventually it closed. Their landlord decided he wanted to not renew the lease and create a martini bar. That's the sort of thing people were doing in the late 90s. I believe that movie Swingers. That's probably what happened. So as it was closing, there was this big blowout with all these bands. People would come, just a big pile of bands over multiple days. They were all going to play a few songs, and it ended with an actual literal riot. So people say, oh, you're a riot, that's a riot. No, this is an actual riot with riot police, and people are ripping the building apart, buildings on fire. So during this, at some point during this, there was an online messaging service back then called ICQ. The three letters ICQ, which sounded like sort of I seek you. And so it had the advantage to where it gave you the ability to get offline messages. So some point during the actual literal riot, I was able to get this information, this number, and have it, later. So first, it proves that riot flirting is an actual thing. If anyone is like, well, oh, do you have a date? Do you have a date to the to cotillion or what have you? Be like, oh, no, I was too busy at the riot. They just weren't trying hard enough. But second, you really have a case to where this is a very chaotic situation. There's, even though it's like strangely people are in fairly good moods and spirits are high, there was bottles and rocks being thrown. There was a big hunk of the building was on fire. There was riot police running around. It was a mess. So I basically say that if you would come with the story and you would have too much information, I would actually question the accuracy of your account. I had no time to take notes. And, and like Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that was a face punch. That's a mess. So there is something, it's there's a book called Black Swan, and it can refer to either the Black Swan theory, Black Swan principle. It's Nassim Nathan Taleb. And it comes to the idea that there will be these giant societal events. And with these events, people will just be shocked, and the actual Black Swan, there's an actual Black Swan tour in England, before they, went to Australia, they would say like a black swan, and it would basically mean an impossibility, something that couldn't happen. So they traveled to Australia. Where do they find? Black swans. So now they've got to go back and sort of, using the phrase retcon, but with hindsight, have the ability to sort of go back and rethink the situation, to fill in the blanks. And, we often do that with our stories. There's things that we couldn't know, that we can't know, but we think, well, it's probably this. And so a lot of personal stories have a great amount of detail. It'll be, oh, well, I remember I was 8 and I was sleeping on my great aunt's back porch and the air smelled of lilac. A mosquito bite itched on the back of my knee, and that's how people are out there sharing their stories. Now, I'll say this. If you go to someone and you have a great amount of detail, often this is usually seen as a sign of prevarication. If the police pull you over and you've got an extremely detailed story, they're not going to believe you. Yet often as we share our stories, we added all this extra detail, and it really just needs to go. Now, sometimes as the case, see how it goes. You get a thing to where I like the Nietzsche quote that talking much about oneself can be a means to conceal oneself. We're not comfortable with saying, I don't know. You know, I worked at a job once and they had an internship program. And one of the questions that I liked that was on the intern evaluation, maybe it'll be on the evaluation that comes at the end of this class here, is, does this person work well with ambiguity? So, I think that's that kind of what we should all embrace here. We should try to ask ourselves, did this happen? Is this what happened? What can we say really happened? Or is this kind of an addition? Is this something we feel probably happened or we wish could have happened? A Mark Twain quote that I like, it's kind of attributed to him, kind of rewording. So I'll give it to you in the paraphrase, is that basically, fiction is a lot easier than writing nonfiction because the fiction, you know, it's like basically the nonfiction. How'd that go? I don't know. Don't worry about it. Mark Twain. Actually, it's that nonfiction is a lot harder than fiction. Wait, no. We'll skip that. It's something. It's something. Basically, that fiction has to make sense and nonfiction doesn't. Okay, there we go. See, that was very ambiguous. So what I would like you to do for this point is to consider something similar to the Clausewitz fog of war, the Donald Rumsfeld known unknowns. Get back to sort of the Socrates where he said that all he knew was he didn't know anything. What do we really know happened? What can we really say, especially about hectic events? A third point that I'd work with is, getting back to ancient Greece. From there, you had the Stoics that moved on into ancient Rome. And so there was a specific Stoic, Epictetus. And basically, he said that it was not, things that bothered us, but our opinions, impressions, our feelings about the things. And so from there, he asked us to examine situations and come up with the idea of, are you really the thing or are you the appearance of the thing? Um, and so from here, you have a case to where it's, various therapies have adopted this idea. There's the cognitive behavioral therapy. And, someone just added, by the way, that, in quote, that truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. So there we go. Mark Twain. And so what we have here is, these various therapies. And so the idea being that we're looking into, what actually happened and are we adding extras to it? The creating cognitive distance. An example here is, I was kind of looking through some photos, there's a lot of high school photos, there's a lot of photos of parties, and we had a kind of situation that a lot of adults were just gone. We're living in this small town and we hit like 14, 15, and the adults, it was a different generation, it was a different time, and this sounds crazy as I tell these stories. They were largely just gone once we were 14, 15. It was a lot of us kids that were kind of, teaching each other to drive and, baking cakes for each other for birthdays after our moms, listened to Sheryl Crow and headed off to the bar to find a new stepdad. So, here we are. And at the time, it's like as teens, we were very frustrated. It was very, everything was awful. Everything, it's the very definition of awfulizing. But, recently, I've come to kind of, and I've talked to various other people and many of them feel the same. Teens are kind of, it's a case to where it's like, here we are, we had lots of friends, we had lots of fun, we all had, we were all loved. And it's a case to where it's like, we were just kind of awfulizing back then, that everything, it's like everything was terrible. It was largely those hormones and whatever was making Surge green. We drank a lot of that stuff. And so what we need to do, and what I try to do, is to kind of rethink the situation, try to be as objective as possible. As a third point, what can we say is happening and what have we kind of added on? What are the extras? An interesting thing here is there is kind of, you could say it's a writing experiment. You could say it's a thought experiment. There is sort of E prime. It is a form of English that basically tries to not use or does not use the verb to be. And so something is not true. Now, interesting thing here when it comes to couples therapy, there are cases to where, let's say you are You have a roommate, and let's say you're saying, oh, well, my roommate did not do the dishes today. And it's like, that's an objective statement. They did not do the dishes. And that's fine. That's something that could be remedied. You can say, well, it's your turn to do the dishes. You should do the dishes. Once you move past that to my roommate is a lazy slob, you basically create a situation to where now you have problems. You've basically that's a thing that will be seen as a bad sign for that particular relationship. And so the only difference is the value judgment. The objective statement was fine, and that could be something that could be discussed in remedy. But once you start adding extras to it, once you start filtering it through opinions, you have some trouble. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, um, it's like he's famous for the quote, hell is other people. Now, this comes from a play, No Exit, and he had a very specific meaning that was related to this. It wasn't just that, hell, people being hell in general, although it feels like that way as we drive around many towns these days. But specifically, he did not like the idea that people could convert him to a thing, that, Sartre is this or that. And so that frustrated him. He wanted to be able to define himself. So once again, getting this idea of definitions and definings. So the only caveat here, is it's when I first started writing, I used a lot of literary devices, allusion, allegory, metaphor, that sort of thing. And now I'm just like, well, stepdad drank himself to death. It can take time. You can find a way to write about all these things. Um, and I always like to wish that people can find a way to write what they now cannot write. But this is all a process of kind of stripping down in these three different ways. So what I'm going to ask you to do now with another few minute break uh, is kind of distill your original story. I like the kind of a quote from the Tao Te Ching. It's a Stephen Mitchell version. Can you wait until your mud settles and your water is clear? And so what I'm asking you do is to consider the three different items I brought up here. It's like one, it's sort of the realness, not to, to try to strip away some of the extras as are currently used for your area, and the curation to try to strip away the extras that maybe you've added, things that you could say made sense or should be or could be, but you're not 100% sure about, and also to be as objective as possible with your stories. The idea here is to get sort of a word base, to get yourself an idea base, to get something that we're later going to assemble. And so I will give you, how about another 5 minutes? I talked a lot. It was that Mark Twain situation. Got me all messed up. Okay, if you have any questions, add them in the chat and let's go. And we're back. So now I've asked you to do two things total. Select a story, and from there, kind of work with a few different elements to kind of distill, to kind of strip that story down, to try to reconsider it in terms of a few different elements, with your realness, your curation, keeping it objective to get you something of a word base and an idea base. Now, you only had 5 minutes here. You can, if you're a prodigy, you can have a lot done. But this is once again something that, is an ongoing process. You can keep working with this. So now from here, as I work, once I'm to this point, really what I do is you're really ready to start assembling something. And it will, and ideally it would be as I would say as short as you can make it, that keeps it interesting. It's something that you want to be able to share. Anybody that has a story they want to share, they want that story to be heard. And I feel that keeping it as pithy as possible is the way to get that story heard. People will find it more interesting. They will embrace it more quickly. It's something that I think kind of shares well online, where we're often limited, to text counts and things of that nature. It's something that it's like it's something that shares well online. It's something that records well. If you go to an open mic night, you've only got a few minutes and you can just stand up and just be like, here's my story and sit back down. It reads well. So what I'm asking you to do is to kind of use what you have so far to start writing. So with this, um, what I really say is, there's a lot of talk about writing and finding your voice. I'm kind of, possibly a heretic here. I'm kind of like the anti-Pygmalion, anti-My Fair Lady. You already have a voice. If you were to have one of your writing samples, just a note that you wrote someone, and you were to send it off, True Crime has told us that they're very able to say who wrote this. If you were to talk to someone in a crowded room, people would know it's you. They recognize your voice. They recognize how you speak and what you say. And so, what I would like you to do is assemble of this in the most natural possible way. Um, and a lot of times, what I do, and this is kind of my tiebreaker, is to read things aloud. And sort of as you write it, read it. If you can read something easily, if it sounds like you, if it flows well, it's you. If you're reading something and you kind of stumble and fumble and bumble over it, I find that, I could read my own stuff fairly easily. I read someone else's and it's sort of like it's hard to read. There's a very kind of unnaturalness to the thing. So what I would like to do now is to give you another 5 minutes, and then, try to start to assemble these ideas and words into something that you can easily read and share. And starting now. My great grandmother died almost 20 years before I was born, hit by a train near Branford, Florida. A very Southern Gothic way to go. I grew up with her stories. Pinches of snuff filled her mouth. Pinches left bruises on your arm. She was a witch. The black snakes crawled as she whistled. There were nail covered photos on the side of her barn, songs to the cypress trees. Her daughter shared these things, all told with affection, enthusiasm, awe. There's a life after life for those who are a good story. And so hopefully with this is just a bit of what I consider as I do write. You find you find some things that you could find interesting and useful as you try to work to share your own stories as poetry, to try to strip down these experiences to where they are in a form that you can share them in this hectic modern era. Only just got a couple minutes left. And so basically, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I had fun. Hopefully everyone else did as well. And, a thing to consider that this is Jack's Poetry Fest, but it's really Jack's Poetry Month, the whole month. There's going to be a lot of events. You should look up. I see Lynn Harlan here. She's got one, I know definitely she has one. And so just look at the calendar, sign up for everything, it'll be a party, a poetry party. With this too, is really a case to where, this is kind of like 3 hurried 5-minute segments. I was asked kind of in a question to where it's like, basically, do you ever go back and revise? And the answer is yes. I go back and revise things constantly. There might be a story that started off as say 1,200 words, and now I've stripped it down to 3 different stories, taken out some different things. There's a story that I read at Jack's by Jack's a few years ago that actually I took just the end and used it as the setting for like a comic book type project that I was working on, one specific story. So this is something that you can kind of work through and keep working with. Hopefully there's something you find useful. And once again, thank you for joining me. I'll be cut off in about a minute, and there'll be a little QR code with a review and things like that coming up. Have fun. Have a great rest of your day.